It's April 6th, 1977. We're at the Kingdome in Seattle, Washington for opening day of the 1977 season for the Seattle Mariners. This is their first ever game they will play. They are playing against the California Angels. Their starting pitcher for today is Diego Segui. The Mariners would go on to lose this game 7-0, and they would go on to lose 97 more games this season. But that's not what matters. After 65 years, Seattle has finally gotten a baseball team. This team has meant so much to baseball in the 45 years since it was founded. So let's take a look about how they came to be. As I said before, their starting pitcher for today is Diego Segui. He was a pretty good pitcher throughout the majority of his career. He bounced around a lot though between teams and just so happened to land in Seattle in 1977, and he won their opening day job. On a bit of a side note, Diego Segui's son, David Segui, about 20 years later would play on the Mariners. For some reason, almost no photos of David Segui playing on the Mariners exist. So here's one with a giant watermark over it. Thank you, Mitchell Layton. David Segui would get into a fight with Randy Johnson. Randy Johnson at the time was the tallest player in Major League Baseball history at 6 feet 11 inches. Randy Johnson would also throw a pitch that killed a bird that crossed in front of it, so this guy was not someone you wanted to mess around with. A few months later, Randy Johnson would be traded, and this fight was one of the main reasons why. Randy Johnson would end up getting traded to the Houston Astros. Later on, he would play for the Arizona Diamondbacks and win a World Series. He would also throw a perfect game, and that's why Randy Johnson's Hall of Fame plaque is him wearing a Diamondbacks hat, not a Mariners hat. But anyway, back to the original story. The story of how Seattle baseball began starts with one man, Dan Dugdale. In 1913, Dan Dugdale built Dugdale Field. It was considered one of the finest baseball stadiums on the entire West Coast, the first one to have double-decker bleachers. This baseball stadium would house Seattle's new minor league baseball team, the Seattle Indians. They would play in the Pacific Coast League, which is a league that's still around to this day. Everything was going well for Seattle until July 4th, 1932. That evening, serial arsonist Robert Bruce Driscoll gathered some game papers that were lying around, took a match, lit them on fire, threw them to the grandstands, and lit them on fire. He retreated to a nearby hill, and the entire stadium burned to the ground. He would later be caught in 1934 and would confess to burning down the baseball stadium. Now the Seattle baseball team had nowhere to go. They needed to find a new stadium to play in, and they had one in Civic Stadium. It was located in downtown Seattle, right next to where the Space Needle would be built in about 30 years' time. But there was just one problem. There was no grass on the playing field. It was entirely dirt and rocks. The team wasn't very good, the fans weren't happy, the owner wasn't happy, they were losing money, and the team almost had to fold. And then, in 1938, they were sold to local beer magnate Emil Sick. Emil Sick came in and immediately changed things. First of all, he changed the name from the Seattle Indians to the Seattle Rainiers. Then, he started work on a brand new stadium called Sick Stadium, directly on top of the old burned-down Dugdale Field. And just a few years after Emil Sick bought the team, Sick Stadium would be complete, and the Seattle Rainiers immediately became a powerhouse. The Seattle Rainiers would make 4 straight league championship games, and they would win 3 of them. 3 in a row, in fact, from 1940 to 1942. After they won those initial championships, they were just a pretty good team for the next few years. But in the back half of the 1940s, they would slide into some mediocrity. But everything changed for the Seattle Rainiers in 1951, thanks to their brand new manager, Rogers Hornsby. Rogers Hornsby was an incredible baseball player for the St. Louis Cardinals in the 1920s. He hit over 400 for 3 consecutive seasons. Once he was hired, the team immediately changed. They went back into their winning ways from the early 1940s and would make it to the playoffs in 1951. In the first round of the 1951 Pacific Coast League Championship playoffs, the Seattle Rainiers would play against the Los Angeles Angels in a best-of-3 series. They would end up winning the first game, losing the second game, and then barely squeaking out the third game to take a 2-1 series victory and advance to the championship series against the Hollywood Stars. It was a back-and-forth championship series. Seattle won Game 1, Hollywood won Game 2, Seattle won Game 3, and Hollywood won Game 4. Game 5 would be back in Seattle for the championship. The winner of the game would be the 1951 Pacific Coast League champion. Seattle ended up winning the game 9-2 and would claim another Pacific Coast League championship. After that, Seattle would win one more championship in 1956, and that was really it for the Seattle Rainiers. because Seattle had moved on to something else. They were trying to get a Major League Baseball team. Seattle first tried to get a Major League Baseball team through relocation, because at the time, Major League Baseball teams were moving all over the country. The Milwaukee Braves, the Cleveland Spiders, and the Kansas City Athletics all expressed interest in moving to Seattle, but those plans eventually fell through. But those same Kansas City Athletics do end up helping Seattle, because they moved to Oakland, and that made one very important person very, very unhappy. That person was Missouri Senator Stuart Symington. Stuart Symington was so furious over losing the Kansas City Athletics that he threatened to sue Major League Baseball over their antitrust exemption, which made it so MLB could operate as a monopoly. So instead of going to court against Stuart Symington, they decided to give Kansas City another team, the Kansas City Royals. But this would have left an odd number of teams in the American League, so they needed to create another one, so scheduling would be easier. They searched around for a while and eventually settled on Seattle for the location of their next expansion team. They would be called the Pilots. It was agreed upon that both teams would begin play in 1971, which would give plenty of time for Seattle to turn Sick's Stadium from a minor league ballpark to a major league level ballpark. But Symington didn't want to wait until 1971 for the Kansas City Royals. He wanted them now. So AL owners met again and moved up both teams' opening days to 1969. So it happened. Seattle had finally gotten a baseball team. In 1969, the Seattle Pilots were founded, and they were one of the worst ideas in the history of sports. As fast as they came into existence, they left. After just one season, the Seattle Pilots left and became the Milwaukee Brewers. It's not really difficult to understand why either. It was because of their stadium. If I were to tell you everything wrong with Sick's Stadium, we would be here until tomorrow. So let's not do that. Let me give you a quick rundown. The main reasons they left were bad viewing conditions for the fans, not enough seats, and not any good places for photographers to be. But the number one reason that they left was because of the plumbing. The plumbing at Sick's Stadium was horrible. But the main thing that they cared about is that the Pilots were gone. They left town and became the Milwaukee Brewers. They were bought by future MLB Commissioner Bud Selig. It's almost unheard of for a brand new team to leave its market after just one season. It's only happened 2 other times in the history of the major 4 American sports. The first was in 1901 when a different Milwaukee Brewers was founded, and then sold and moved to St. Louis for about 50 years, and then in 1954 they moved to Baltimore and became the Orioles, who are still around to this day. The other time this happened was in 1960, when the Los Angeles Chargers moved to San Diego after just one season. And they definitely stayed there forever and never went back, despite the entirety of Los Angeles forgetting about them. Those poor LA Chargers. The Seattle Pilots were the last time that ever happened. It's hard to see it ever happening again. But all hope was not lost yet. In 1970, the city of Seattle sued the American League again, and things were about to change. King County is the county where Seattle is located, and when the Pilots were given to Seattle, they had started work on a brand new stadium, the Kingdome. It was set to open in the mid-70s, but at the time, there was no baseball team. They did end up getting a new football team in the Seattle Seahawks. But they had sued the American League, and like the last time someone sued the American League, they resolved it by, fine, we'll give you another team. So, in 1977, the American League founded the Toronto Blue Jays in Canada, along with a brand new team in Seattle. But they needed to come up with a name for it. They decided to turn to the public and have a fan voting contest. Thousands of entries were submitted from across Seattle, but the winning entry was the name Mariners, submitted by a Bellevue man named Roger Smodis. There were plenty of other people who also chose the name Mariners, but they chose Roger Smodis because they liked the explanation for why he chose it. The reasoning he gave was, I have chosen the name Mariners for the connection between the sea and Seattle and her people, who have been challenged and rewarded by it. In order to thank Roger Smodis, they decided to give him tickets to a few Mariners games and some gear and things. But there was just one problem. They couldn't find him. They went to his house, he wasn't there. They called him, he didn't answer. They asked everyone, no one could find him. And, over 45 years later, they still have not found Roger Smodis. There was also some other names that were considered for the new Seattle baseball team. The weirdest of all, though, I think, is the Seattle SeaTacs, but they're the rest of them. There you go, that's almost everything. That's how the team came into existence, how it got its name, why it has its name, but we're missing one more thing about opening day, 1977. The best broadcaster in the history of the Seattle Mariners is Dave Niehaus. He called thousands of Mariners games all the way to 2010 before he sadly passed away shortly after that season. He has so many memorable calls such as My Oh My and Swung On and Belted and many more. He also is the reason for several nicknames as well. Alex Rodriguez, they call him A-Rod. That was Dave Niehaus. Why did they call Ken Griffey Jr. the Kid? Dave Niehaus. His most famous call, however, is probably the double in the 1995 ALDS against the New York Yankees. That's a story for another time, though. He is the perfect person to call the Mariners' first ever game. Before we get to April 6th, 1977, there are two other things that are important to this story. Number one is that Diego Segui, the starting pitcher for this game, actually pitched for the Seattle Pilots. He's the only player in history to ever play for the Seattle Pilots and the Seattle Mariners. And a few years after the Seattle Pilots left town, they tore down Sick's Stadium and instead they built a Lowe's on top of it. So, outside of this Lowe's, they put a plastic propped up batter. I don't know why, and it's clearly in everyone's way, and it hasn't been taken down yet, so if you're in the area, I'd recommend go seeing it. But anyway, back to April 6th, 1977. We have finally arrived. Here we go.
Thank you, Ken Wilson. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the initial voyage of the Seattle Mariners. Diego Segui, the first pitch in history is a strike, taken at the knees by Jerry Remy, leading it off. And the crowd roars.